So welcome back. My name's Sally Cripps, and this session is on threats to democracy, because I'd also like us to explore not only the threats but the potential opportunities that technology can offer. Just to set the scene before I introduce my fantastic speakers, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the relationship between democracy and technology over the last 200 years. That's a graph that's showing various forms of democracy and how it have changed from about 1780 to very, very recently. And of course, this change in democracy was accompanied by a lot was happening in the world at that time, many, many things. And I'm a statistician, and I don't know if any of you have heard of the wonderful Hans Rosling, but he has done an animated BBC thing. He's perhaps the world's only charismatic statistician, and he has animated in real time how the health and wealth of societies have changed. From 1810, if you go onto the BBC website, you can find this, through to 1960, and right through to 2009 was when this presentation was made. And his point is that everybody was poor and sick back in 1810. The life expectancy was less than 40 years. People were not wealthy, but aligned with the growth in democracy, we saw this enormous expansion of health and wealth across the human race. Now, he attributes this, and many would agree with him, to a rise in technology. You know, he attributes it to the Industrial Revolution. And when you look at the data, that seems to be a really compelling story. It really is. But when you actually plot the technology versus the democracy, they're not always the same. So, for example, here we have a scatter plot of, you've got democracy, the industrial production on one axis and democracy on the other. The point of this graph is actually not to take away from it how you draw a line through a graph, because it's actually a very poor example of that. But the point to take away from it is that technology and democracy have gone hand in hand, but in different ways over time. There are different relationships over time. And this example here was what I've called the swinging 60s, if you go in, and I'm sure Peter is looking at it, remembering fondly. So that's the swinging 60s. Unfortunately, what you do see in the graph about democracy, you can see everything has been going up, and then just at the very end, for about the last 10 years or so, it's been coming off quite noticeably. And I think that is what people have been worried about. And in fact, those points correspond to these ones over here. So they're much lower than what you would expect, that relationship with technology and democracy. So that's a setting of the scene. So what is it about this relationship with democracy and technology? How can we understand what's happening now in the context of the past? And that's why we have, and also looking forward into the future. So just to say, what is technology? So possible explanations. I'm just going to put a few ideas out there. I'm going to introduce my speakers very shortly, not just yet, about why this might be the case. So I don't think it's a surprise here to anybody that ChatGPT, and generative AI has enabled misinformation and disinformation in the extreme at a scale that's probably unprecedented. My wonderful colleagues at the Human Technology Institute have also written about the way that facial recognition technology violates privacy in an invisible and at a scale and speed never actually done before. So these are things that have really made, and these are important things. Privacy, reliable and trustworthy information are incredibly important things for functioning democracies, as we heard from the speeches this morning. I was, though, on the upside, I was very privileged enough to meet Audrey Tang. Audrey Tang was Taiwan's first digital minister. She single-handedly really set about trying to democratise, or trying to use digital platforms to enhance democracy, and in fact turned the government's approval rating round from 9% in about 2014 to 90% in 2020, which dropped again slightly to 60%. So a remarkable achievement in building trust between governments and people, enabled, at least in Taiwan, by digital platforms. So hang on. So now I get on to my speakers. So this, I've hopefully painted a picture that sometimes, you know, it works, sometimes it doesn't, and I would like to introduce my speakers. They're going to talk about different aspects of it. So the first speaker I'd like to introduce is Professor Ed Santow. Ed is the co-founder and co-director of the Human Technology Institute at UTS. He was Australia's Human Rights Commissioner. He is on the board of many charities. Ed, together with Professor Nick Davis, also are the leading experts in AI regulation and governance in Australia. So that's Ed. He's going to be the first speaker, and he's going to be talking about the impact of, you know, AI on human rights, and he's written a wonderful book, which I've put up there, which you would all be, you know, I'm sure will summarise a lot of what Ed is saying today, but it's a great book. My next speaker is actually going to be Darren Saunders. Darren is the Deputy Chief Scientist of New South Wales, and he has worked in academia and industry for the last 20 years. Darren has had a career that spans not just science and biology and neurology, but also its communication to the public. He's a fantastic speaker. My last speaker is the wonderful Fatemeh Vafaee, who is an associate professor at the School of Biotechnology and Biomolecular Science, thank you, at the University of New South Wales. She is also co-director or deputy director of the Data Science Hub. She has spent her work actually applying AI to medical applications, but actually right down at the cellular level. And she's going to talk about the possible benefits of this, but also ways in which it can harm and what that might look like. So without any further ado from me, I am going to hand over to Ed. Ed.
Well, thank you very much, Sally, for that warm introduction. I'm going to talk about the intersection of freedom of expression, technology, and particularly artificial intelligence, and our democracy. I say that because I'm going to take a circular route to get there, but I want you to be confident that I am going to get to that destination. And I'm going to start with a name that I suspect very few, if any of you, have heard of, Stephen Ayres. So Stephen Ayres, if you were of a more writerly bent and were trying to, sketch the picture of the true 21st century American everyman, it would be Stephen Ayres. He has most of his adult life been in employment, but never a wealthy person. And he's not ever been a particularly politically engaged individual, but he feels very strongly about his identity as an American, and feels particularly a deep sense of pride in being American. Now, Stephen Ayres, to the extent that he will ever become or be known beyond his individual family and friends, is because he committed a serious crime. He was one of the people who was caught up in the January 6 storming of the US Capitol. He was convicted of offences connected with his involvement in what might be described as an attempted coup d'etat. The interesting thing about this, about Stephen Ayres, is he has given a number of reflections about how he ended up in the US Capitol on the 6th of January 4 years ago. And what he kept on saying, the thread of all of his observations, was one, disengagement from conventional sources of news and information, and certainly authoritative sources of news and information. Two, his deep adherence to those values that I referred to at the start. That sense of nationalism, of pride in his country, and also perhaps a sense that others were progressing faster than he was. And then third, the source of information for him, the way in which he understood the world around him, came almost exclusively from Facebook and what was then called Twitter. And so his worldview was largely shaped by swimming in those social media waters. And he said, from that source of information, which was basically the sole source of information that he was getting, he was utterly convinced that the election had been stolen from Donald Trump in 2020, and that the only course of action for a patriotic person like himself was to do what he did. I suspect very few, if any, people in this room would share that worldview, would share that understanding of the facts of what took place in the 2020 election. But nevertheless, I think we need to understand something about it. So I said I wanted to cover sort of three key points. The first relates to freedom of expression. So it's often said by human rightsy people like myself, or Emeritus Professor Rosalind Croucher, whose birthday it is today, and I'm sure she will be upset with me for acknowledging that fact. Human rightsy people like myself often say that freedom of expression is one of the preconditions, not the only, but one of the critical preconditions to a healthy, functioning democracy. And that is true. The problem with that statement is that too often we think of freedom of expression only by reference to one of its two key elements. And that is, we think of freedom of expression as the right to be on transmit, the right to speak, the right to constantly speak whatever you think all of the time. And we probably have never lived in an era where that is more available to us. Notwithstanding the whinging of certain billionaires and others in society, we all hold a virtual microphone as well as, in my case, a real one at the moment. And we can get our voice heard on social media and in so many other forums. But I said a moment ago, freedom of expression has two critical elements. It is not just the right to be on transmit. It is also the right to receive information. And if you are receiving information that is so polluted by falsehood, by false narratives, by narratives that are so inflected by ideology, that you are unable to form a rational view about the facts of the world around you, then you are unable truly to exercise your right to freedom of expression, because the formation of your opinions has been, in a sense, distorted by the pollution of the information environment in which you operate. And so that is a critical concern that I have when we talk about our democracy. And so how does this connect to the second point that I wanted to raise, which is social media and new technology like AI? So it is often said, including embarrassingly by me, that there has been a rise in the number of hoaxes and kind of just the quantum of false information in the world. And I said that because it felt intuitively true, and many people say it because it feels intuitively true. Over the last few years, however, there's been some incredibly powerful and rigorous research about that. And what it shows is something that really shocked me, and that is that there has been, in fact, very little, if any, discernible rise in the number of hoaxes and just simply the quantum of false information out there. That is not the reason why we have a polluted information environment. The reason is subtly but importantly different. What we have seen is instead this phenomenon whereby those sources of authoritative truth, people like the chief scientists or deputy chief scientists, people who have many decades of hard-won expertise in areas of deep learning. Those people who previously would have been able to go on TV or on radio or on the internet and be able to say very clearly, don't put disinfectant into your body as a way of warding off COVID-19 or other really kind of basic facts. They would have been able to do that and they would have been believed. That would have been an authoritative statement that would have very rapidly debunked whatever it was that was the myth of the day. So what we have seen now is, in a sense, a levelling out of truth and falsehood. And what that makes it incredibly difficult to do is to discern what is true and what is false. Which brings me to my last point, which is what is hastening that problem? Well, there are many factors at play, but one of them is indeed the rise of social media, as was exhibited by that anecdote that I started with from Stephen Ayres. Now, if previous sources of truth for the population at large were generally authoritative kind of news media organisations, those organisations have always been imperfect and remain so today. But they generally peddle in truth. They are trying to provide a truthful account of the world, certainly inflected by their own opinions and so on, but there is a market that they are operating in that certainly prizes truth. If you're a news organisation that gains a reputation for telling falsity, that is problematic for you, not just morally, but commercially, and there are a bunch of regulators who do an imperfect job at holding news media organisations and journalists to account when they don't tell the truth. That is not the case for social media organisations. Social media organisations, the currency that they are working with is the currency of attention. So this idea of the attention economy, where the objective is to maximise the amount of time that a social media user is looking at your particular Facebook, Twitter, whatever it happens to be. Now, what the algorithms that operate blindly without any particular ideological bent, what they have, in a sense, revealed to us is that one of the most effective ways at holding people's attention is not to serve up boring truth from human rights commissioners or deputy chief scientists or others, but rather to serve up highly dramatic content, extreme views, things that will kind of really fire our passions. And so when you put all of that together, I am worried about our democracy. I mean, I share the views of Jenny Whalen and Nick Bryant and others earlier today that we're not yet at a point in Australia of kind of utter catastrophe. But the combination of the phenomena that I've just described, I think, presents a very serious threat to our democracy. And unless we're able to pick those things off one by one, so starting with a proper understanding of freedom of expression, this notion that you can be a free speech absolutist by only concerning yourself with the right to be on transmit rather than the right to be on receive. Secondly, the notion that it is healthy for our democracy for people to get their news and core sources of information from sources like social media where the truth is not prized. And thirdly, that we don't need regulation for those phenomena like social media platforms. I think those things all need to be pushed back on very strongly, and those are things that will help to protect our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. That was absolutely wonderful. And I love things in threes. So, because I can remember them, I'm not really good past three, and actually, the point too about the misinformation hasn't increased, but our inability to debunk it is what's at issue, I think is fascinating, and maybe we'll pick that up in some of the questions. But it's now my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Saunders to you.
Thanks, Sally. I'm actually going to, I don't have the oratory skills of a lawyer or a journalist, so I'm going to use my crutch of slides. I'm actually going to flick over this first slide. I promise Ed and I actually didn't compare notes on what we're going to talk about, but it's quite interesting how we have converged on very similar points, and there's one in particular that's going to, I think, get your attention. Okay, what I wanted to do was very quickly talk a little bit about the tension between the risks and benefits of technology, and I'm going to focus just on a couple of bits of technology from my own field. Because I think one of the points I want to make about technology and threats to democracy is it's not necessarily about the technology per se, it's the application of the technology and how that works and how that's perceived that I think is one of the main problems. And there are some unbelievably powerful bits of technology that are currently percolating their way through, not just the way people live their everyday lives, but the way people like me understand fundamental insights into the natural world, into the way our bodies work. So that picture you can see there is a fruit fly brain. Now, fruit flies are one of the favourite things of geneticists to use. They're a really amazing tool to do research on. A fruit fly brain has about 140,000 individual cells in it. Okay? A human brain has tens of billions of cells, so orders of magnitude much more complicated. What you can see there is a complete wiring diagram as to how every single one of those 140,000 neurons connects to every other one of those 140,000 neurons. It's roughly 50 million connections. And that map was just published recently. That map was done by taking a fruit fly brain, which I'm telling you is a very small thing, slicing it up into 7,000 slices and then shooting it through electron microscopes to generate 21 million different images, and then using AI to put all those images back together and generate a 3D map. That is a complete wiring diagram of that brain. You can actually track, and they did this in the research paper, where they tracked the taste response of a fruit fly, where it got a taste of sugar, and you could see the wiring diagram light up from the taste receptors all the way through to the motor cortex and the muscles responding to that taste reception. That's just an example, it's a very small example, of the sort of application of technology to understanding fundamentals of the way things work. They're currently doing the same thing to get the human brain. It's a much bigger problem, but that's one example. And another example from my world of molecular neuroscience, that's a picture of the Milky Way. You look up into our own galaxy has tens of billions of stars, give or take a few. An individual brain cell in your brain has roughly the same number of stars. So 10 billion stars in the sky, roughly 10 billion individual protein molecules in a single brain cell. Right? And there's tens of billions of those cells in every brain. That's a big problem. That's a very hard problem to solve on a human timescale without technology. And the recent announcement of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was around the use of AI technology to understand how each of those individual proteins folds. And the reason that's important is because proteins work through three-dimensional structure. When they don't fold, you get things like Alzheimer's disease, motor neuron disease, all sorts of horrible things happening. So that's another interesting application of technology. I'm going to get to the point in a sec. A really interesting sort of side take of this is a thing called synthetic biology, where we're using our ability to manipulate genomes, to manipulate that basic chemical foundation of life into all kinds of weird and wonderful ways that don't exist in nature. Literally reinventing life forms, reinventing the way in which we code genetic information. And the sort of applications, to give you some idea, this is around agriculture, around new forms of food and fuel and fibre. Medicine, it's a really important tool that we're now using in generating synthetic fuels to work towards net zero and decarbonisation. It's even being used as a way of designing semiconductors. And it's inventing entirely new forms of life that sit outside any kind of philosophical notion of life and way beyond any regulatory notion of life. And just one more example. This is a thing called Athena, which the Rural Fire Service in New South Wales have recently implemented. It's an AI tool that essentially sucks in information from every possible source, so weather, satellites, on-ground eyewitness reports from firefighters and planes flying over. It also sucks in social media, any geotagged pictures of a fire truck going past or of a bit of smoke in the middle of the forest somewhere. It sucks all of that information in. It overlays it with years and years worth of modelling work that's been done at CSIRO, and it's a fire prediction tool. And the RFS now use this to predict impact on people and buildings and for deploying resources. So all these amazing uses of technology that most of us never even give a passing thought to in our everyday lives. And I think one of these bits of technology that really highlights some of the issues is the use of genomics. So genomics has been around for a while now. You've probably all heard of the Human Genome Project, that effort to map the basic chemical instruction book of life. Where this is going wrong is in the misapplication of it. It's fundamentally challenging some of our notions of individual identity, of cultural identity. It's got fundamental issues around privacy. I'm going to show an example in a moment that really gets to that. And at the heart of all of the misapplications or problems of genomics in particular is control. It's control of technology and control of the information that comes from deploying that technology. There are also lots of regulation and ethical issues with that. But a really interesting example is this company called 23andMe, and some of you may have heard of this. This is an American company that invited people to, for the cost of a couple of $100, basically get their human genome. You could send a saliva sample off to this company, pay them a couple of $100, they would send you back a map of your genome, they would tell you all sorts of information about disease risk, about your cultural heritage, you know, where your family came from back in your family tree. It was personalised genomics, right? In fact, what this company was all about is collating that genetic information from millions of different people and selling it to drug companies, because that's incredibly useful and powerful information. Now, most of the people that signed up to do this didn't read the fine print and didn't realise that that's in fact what the business model was. That company is now going broke, and there's it looks like it's going to be sold onto another company, and suddenly everybody that's given their data to this company is suddenly going, oh, oops, this is a bit of a problem, I don't like somebody else owning my data. You know, the implications of this are huge, not just for insurance, huge implications for understanding family histories, and there's lots of disastrous examples of people finding out things they didn't know about their family. But also that notion of control of your own genetic data. So I think that, that notion of control and misinformation is one I want to touch on a little bit more. And this deployment of genomics in medicine in particular has led to a really interesting problem, and it gets to the thing that Ed touched on. A lot of people have this notion now, and it's because we do a good job in my world of hyping this sort of idea of precision medicine or personalised medicine. This idea that you can walk into hospital, you know, the handsome doctor will read your genome and hand you back your personalised medicine, right? Bespoke, designed for your cancer or your neurological condition. And in fact, in some cases, this is now reality. There are some conditions where this is in fact the way we do things. It is incredibly expensive. There's a condition called spinal muscular atrophy, which is a disease that affects young children, where their central nervous system basically degrades and they lose control of their ability to use all their limbs and eventually die from not being able to breathe. There is now a genetic medicine for that disease. It's literally saving young kids' lives, but it costs millions of dollars, like millions of dollars. It's the world's most expensive medicine. It raises all sorts of issues around equity of access, around cost. The problem is with this huge expectation around this medicine, and the reality is that for most people in this room, if you walked into hospital with any of the common conditions, you won't get personalised medicine. We're not there yet. So there's a huge trust deficit. There's a huge level of disappointment around the level of expectation that comes from hype. And the reason that's important is because it enables these kind of people. Okay, so there's Pete Evans and Bill Gibson. They're two examples of social media influencers who have become infamous, made an awful lot of money over selling false hope to people based on people's loss of trust in normal medicine. People who've experienced the fact that they can't go to the doctor and get their personalised medicine, or the GP won't spend the time to really understand what's going on. These people trade on that trust deficit. And I think in COVID this really came to the fore, where we ended up with this conflation of disappointment of vaccine mandates and around social lockdowns. All of those things are conflated into people's minds to a loss of trust in the technology that underpins, for example, vaccination. It's not the only thing. And then we got this weird conflation around the ability of 5G wireless technology to start controlling our bodies through vaccines. And a lot of the psychology of this comes from people reacting to a stressful situation they don't understand. They buy into conspiracy theories that are based on misinformation. The irony of this is that most of the people spreading this information use 5G connected devices to spread it. We'll talk about that separately. And it's sort of, I think, this is where you're going to laugh, Ed, I think the ultimate kind of example of this is that people like me, especially in COVID, had to spend a lot of time going on TV. This is Julia's TV show, actually, Mike. Yeah, going on TV to counter, so Donald Trump would stand up in the morning and give a press conference and tell people, maybe you could drink disinfectant. People like me would then have to spend the rest of the day going, please don't do that, that's a really bad idea. Right? Now, the irony of this is that, in fact, there's very good evidence that in even addressing misinformation, you actually amplify it. It's a wicked problem, and it's a paradox of addressing misinformation. It's incredibly hard to debunk. Okay, so I'll wrap up because I want to hear what Fatemeh's got to say. So there are challenges and risks to this. Okay, I've picked a couple of very small examples to highlight some of those, and really I've designed those to hopefully stimulate some thinking and questions. I haven't touched on defence and security. I think technology in the defence and security space is a whole other can of worms, and there are people in this room much more expert in that than me, so I deliberately didn't touch on that. I think one of the biggest challenges around the application of technology, particularly in medicine, but not just in medicine, is around equity. It's around equity of access, it's around cost. Not having equity in the way these technologies are applied will undermine trust, and ultimately that's a really big problem, as Ed so beautifully put forward. There's a lot of bias and assumptions built into the way we build these models too, by the way. A lot of the genomic information we had is built on people that look like me, and the human race is a much more diverse population than that, and we're missing a whole bunch of things because of some of those inbuilt assumptions and biases. I think some of the big challenges are around the control of technology and data, and again, undermining trust, and also the use of some of this information in a surveillance method. You can now go, there was an amazing paper published a few years ago, people went around and swabbed the handles on all of the subway stations in New York City and sequenced the DNA they found. Not only did they find that there was things like the plague still hanging around in the rats of New York, but they could actually racially profile the various immigrant populations of all the different boroughs of New York and all the different little neighbourhoods of Manhattan based on the DNA that they were leaving when they touched the handle on the subway. So there are kind of uses of this sort of technology that are beyond our comprehension, but that are almost certainly being used for very bad purposes. And a lot of that is underpinned by misunderstanding and misinformation. And I think all of those things together really start to hit on the social license to use this technology. And we're seeing this with vaccines. We saw this with genetically modified food. I have a really big concern that all of the new vaccines that have been enabled by the technology that came out through COVID are going to face significant hurdles when we start to give them to the community to say, hey, look at this amazing stuff we made for you. I think there's a lot of hesitancy and a lot of mistrust in a lot of parts of the community around those. That causes issues when you start to look at policy, and the application of technology collides with policy often. A lot of this technology that tells us, here's a particular problem and here's a particular way to fix it, doesn't always align with the way that policy is formulated or the way that policy is applied. That also causes issues with trust in government and people not feeling that they have a say in the democracy. And I'm going to stop there. I've hopefully just provided some points for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darren. It's amazing to think of all the topics and all the breadth of the work that you cover. And it was very insightful also linking it to equity and how that plays into democracy. So thank you for a great talk. Our final speaker is Fatemeh, and talking about equity to access health. I'm sure Fatemeh has got a lot to say about that with her work, and I'd like to welcome Fatemeh to come and talk.
So, I had a very brief overview of myself, which kindly Sally has introduced me. First of all, I would like to say thank you, Sally, to Christy for the invitation. That's a great pleasure to be here. Very nice discussions today. Just one sentence, that I see myself as a AI citizen, while sort of AI has been adopted recently. Sure, thank you. Better? So I see myself as AI citizen in a sense that I have been in field for more than 15 years. I had my PhD in computer science, artificial intelligence in 2011 when the first sort of model deep learning techniques has been basically published. So I have been contributed in the field since then. And over 10 years of experience of leadership in biomedicine. I have multiple hats on, an associate professor, team leader, and also sort of entrepreneurship hat on and in a proprietary company to basically have impact and bring these innovations of AI in the hands of patients, basically. So, what I would like to talk to you today about is about both sort of positive and negative sides of AI in technology, but in particular examples like in AI. And give you 3 opportunities that AI can bring to democracy as well as three threats. So basically, alongside all of these amazing opportunity is threats, which I would like to basically bring both of them into the picture. I see myself as a thoughtful optimist of adoption of AI. So I'm going to start with opportunities. Oops, can you see the slide? Okay, coming up. First and foremost, equitable access and democratization of expertise. AI has the capacity to basically enable access to diagnostics and expertise anywhere and at any time. What you see in the image is basically, I don't know exactly what you see. Do you see the bus? Like, this is Millie. This is Millie, the Brussels Screen Northern Territory bus, which basically Brussels Screen Northern Territory is having its bus into the remote areas and doing the mammography screening for over 1,000 women across over 20 different communities, Aboriginal communities. And imagine a future that these women would have access to the best diagnosis of their mammography images right within their communities with no cost. I think that democratization of access to expertise and specialty is one of the key drivers of democracy, which AI can heavily contribute to, no matter whether we are coming from regional areas or major cities, or have access to the next network of expertise, or not having access to that, and also whether we can afford the visits to specialties. With AI, we can have a solution which is affordable and accessible to all. Noting that building and training AI systems is very costly. But once it is deployed at a scale, querying AI systems has negligible cost and can be basically quite affordable solution. Beyond that is translation and customization of health information. During COVID-19, for instance, AI has played an important role to be able to translate the information around sort of the regulations and what should be done to different communities and different languages. And this is very important in Australia in particular because we are a multicultural, multilingual country. But also, it's not just beyond translation. We have seen in an amazing improvement in translation capacities of Gen AI or generative AI these years. But it's not just about translation, it's customization of information, making that quite suitable to your need and to your understanding. Again, I think this is a very important sort of democratic principle that can be empowered and reinforced by AI. Moving forward is enhanced decision-making and accelerated discovery. A few years ago, MIT news has been released, an important news, that AI can detect breast cancer from mammography images 5 years before that can be detected in a regular way. Basically, AI can detect subtle patterns of initiation of tumors which can be easily missed by human eyes and human experts. And this is not just about images. Well, there has been a huge improvement in diagnosis of medical images across any sector and any type of images. It's way beyond that. As Darren has also covered, there is sort of molecular measurements. One of the areas that we are working quite extensively in that field over the last 7 years or so has been on liquid biopsies. We are measuring several thousands of molecules from a few drops of blood and use that to diagnose cancer or basically treatment response monitoring. And with sequencing technologies, genomics technologies or next-generation sequencing technologies, we have the ability to measure several thousands of molecules. And this is basically an area which is inaccessible to human. This is a playground of AI. With AI, we would be able to make sense of patterns in data and being able to basically decipher the phenotypic changes to be able to use that for diagnostics and others. So we have been adopted that in multiple fields, in multiple cancer types. We have used that for early diagnosis, for tests that they are currently in the phase of commercialization, for monitoring the progression of tumor cancer, which is very hard to be accessed and very sort of coming with a lot of side effects and very costly for people to be monitored. So assuming that a blood test and looking into molecules with AI, we would be able to monitor the treatment response without the need to be basically opening the skull up. And this is not just about molecules or images. From genomic to microbiome to medical images to sensor data, wearable sensors, electronic health record, we are surrounded with diverse types of data which once they are fused together, we would be able to have some sort of comprehensive view of health and disease. And this is what I see as future of precision medicine and personalized therapy. We are yet to be there. And there is a bit of sort of disappointment in the field that whether that would be attainable or not. But from my point of view, precision medicine and such sort of holistic integration of information wouldn't be possible without the help of AI. So these types of increased in prosperity and growth of the society definitely reinforce the democratic basically principles. And also what is important from personalized medicine is that we don't have a solution which one fits all. We make that personalized. If I would have a genome which deviates from the average, I wouldn't be disadvantaged. And again, it's quite sort of relevant to democratic principles. So citizen empowerment and enhanced autonomy, which I'm going to be very quick on these topics. So we all know that AI can bring citizen empowerment. There is a dark side of that which has been covered, and I would have sort of a bit of discussion around that, which would be the process of increasing the capacity of individuals to basically take control of their decision that is affecting them. And basically that involves the tools and resources which provide this information to the citizen. So access to information can be improved in the context of health, sort of personalized health management, as well as decision support system right in your fingertips. So this is very important that we would be able to have self-control and self-care and would be more autonomous in that way. And also it's going to facilitate community support because it enables people to connect to each other and basically aggregate information, and that would be sort of important to reflect decision makers and policy makers as well. But the flip side of this benefit is surveillance and privacy erosion that has been addressed previously. So AI often rely on a lot of information, a lot of personal information, and how this information are used, whether it has been sort of sold out to the third parties, and whether it has been used to basically monitor people, that would be an absolute sort of threat to democracy, we can think. And also it has a chilling effect of freedom of expression. If we think that we have been watched, we would basically self-censor itself. And again, sort of this is against of the freedom of speech, as Ed has covered as well. Bias. Bias is another very important and a scary part of AI. And it refers to some sort of systematic errors that is basically reinforce the prejudice outcomes. It can be in many different fields, as you can see here. And in the context of health is quite important, but it goes anywhere, basically. I would like to give you an example of generative AI and the bias that it has, and I'll provide you like more example in the context of health and things that we're dealing with ourselves. I asked GPT that draw a picture of a scientist, and this is what GPT has drawn. I then asked, draw a picture of a university professor, and then this is what I received. I then asked, draw a picture of a director of a research center in AI. And then this is what GPT has drawn for me. And then I ask, draw a picture of a CEO of a company. And this is what I received. And no matter how many times I've tried my luck, that was the same thing. And you can already see the bias in these images. I then ask, hey GPT, draw myself based on the information that you have from me. And this is what I received. You still see that there is a bias here. There is nothing sort of except that it's a woman between this image and myself. But I asked GPT, how do you know that I am a woman? And it said to me that because you won an award of AI, Women in AI in APAC, and this is how I concluded that you're a woman. Good, intelligent, awesome. And then I ask, I am a university professor, director of a center, and CEO of a company. Draw my picture. And this is what I received. You're so dumb, okay? So, bias in data and equality in decision is beyond that, okay? Beyond professions, that is quite sort of obvious at the moment. We have been working, for instance, in a blood test to diagnose breast cancer. We collected samples from the sort of Eastern Europe. Originally, we built a model which has a very high sensitivity and specificity to basically complement mammography. We then bring that test to Australia. We wanted to test it here, and we realized that it's not working well for women that they are not Caucasian. And this is the bias in data that has been basically reflected in the model. The model has been trained mostly on Caucasian ethnicity, and it's unable to predict the disease properly for any other ethnicity, which is quite diverse in Australia. And these are the things that can be addressed quite. I will finish that very quickly. So transparency and interpretability. I'll finish that in 2 minutes. So I may ask you that what is how AI work? And you may say, I don't know. I would say that you're not alone. No one knows how AI work. If you go to the experts, they know a lot about how to build the AI, but basically they don't know that how AI works inside. And this is because it is often considered as a black box, and this black box is not a mysterious box. It's just because this is basically a sort of relationships of millions to billions to trillions of numbers that they are added and multiplied in a very complex way together to give an outcome. And understanding the representation and how they work is very hard, even for those that they have created such a technology. And again, we have used different metrics to be able to increase transparency and accountability in the context of medicine, but that should be really go beyond that. And I would like to finish with this slide, noting that with that preposition and state of affair that we are in, we don't know how AI work. We are in a state that we can't predict the outcome. We don't know what is happening. We are in a fragile situation. How we can move on from fragile to anti-fragile situation, which we can use that as an opportunity to adopt, is basically where we need to move on from knowing the certainty to being able to be adaptable. And that is possible when we would have the measurements in place. We would be able to measure the impacts of AI. We would have disclosure and audit what companies are doing in the context of AI and have incidents report. And I finish with one note that there is no way to not embracing AI. We need to embrace AI, but responsibly.
That was a fantastic talk about AI, and I really loved the bias example, and you were still a white man at the end of it all, so yeah. So I'm going to, do we have time? Do I have time for one question? Yeah. So if we have any questions from the audience. So can we give us a microphone?
Thank you to the panellists. That was a great discussion. My name is SM from the Office of the Chief Scientist Engineer. Hi, Darren. I really loved hearing about the different perspectives here about tech and how it can influence democracy and misinformation, and also about this equity and bias issue. And so we heard about from Darren, you know, how genomics and medicine, it's biased basically. It's what data is actually trained on. The fact that it's mainly, you know, Caucasian people, and you touched on it as well, Fatemeh, and about AI and the data it's trained on as well. So I'd like the panel's thoughts on how this will affect democracy across the globe, not just Australia, considering in medicine, in genomics, and in AI, you do have this bias. And in fact, there was also research recently that showed even just languages through ChatGPT, if you're English speaking, you have a benefit. The data you will get and the responses you will get will be so much better than, say, if you're from a minority language or population. You just get terrible information. So I guess what I'm asking is your reflections on how you think this will go for democracy in Australia, which is so diverse, and also for the global population.
Okay. Sort of, I have technical hat on in terms of how we can deal with bias. And I would like to beforehand make a note as well that all of or many of these sort of threats that AI can bring should be resolved with a combination of both regulation and technology. So we can use the technology to reduce the impact, the harm impacts of AI. For instance, in the context of bias, if you would be able to measure, that measurement is important, how the model is biased towards sort of particular ethnicity or anything else, that would help both for users as well as for providers to be able to align, as well as regulators to align the sort of regulations and the use to reduce the bias. In the context of, for instance, ethnicity in particular, we are working on reducing the bias in data, both within the model as well as further sort of well-distributed collection of the data across different ethnicities. But it's way more complex than that when it comes into how we can mitigate the bias within the models and algorithms. And what is important is transparency as well as sort of technological insights to be able to handle that.
Hi, thank you. This is a question, I think, for all of you, particularly for Ed and Darren. In the context of the sort of misinformation, disinformation, lack of trust in authority that I think has just gone off that we're seeing, do you think there's a need to start explicitly teaching critical thinking in educational institutions and particularly in schools? I have 2 teenage daughters, and while critical thinking seems to be somewhat built into the curriculum, as an explicit discussion about sources, about truth, about what sources are you accessing your information from? Is that something that we now need to step up and actually be teaching explicitly in primary or senior schools?
The short answer is yes. I think it's hugely useful for all of the reasons I guess you're alluding to. The longer answer, though, is that I have a bit of a concern where we direct our solutions towards the victims of some of this sort of bad behaviour, in this case misinformation, disinformation, themselves having to take responsibility for protecting themselves. This sounds a bit like a parable, but I've been doing all this work on facial recognition technology, and I gave this big speech in front of all these people and talking about all of the ills about facial recognition kind of leading to a kind of a mass surveillance society. And at the end of my speech, this gentleman put his hand up and he said, you've talked about all kinds of solutions here, legal solutions, that kind of thing. To be honest, I've got a much better solution than any of the ones that you've come up with. And I said, oh yes, okay, I'm all ears here. I got my pen out and started getting ready to write it down. He goes, well, whenever I'm out in public, I wear a beak. I go, oh, a beak? Tell me more. He said, well, yes, it's quite a big beak, modelled on a particularly exotic bird from South America, and it beats all of the facial recognition systems. And really, if everyone just learnt to wear a beak, we'd be fine. And I thought, well, you might not be wrong, but I don't like the idea that we're having to ask people to contort themselves into wearing beaks, both figuratively and metaphorically, in order to push back on some of the inherent problems with this technology. So yes, wear a beak when necessary, but on the whole, we should be designing and regulating the technology better so it's more human-centred.
You'd have to give him full marks for lateral thinking. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yes, indeed. Yeah,
I mean, that's what I was thinking.
I think there's just one little other aspect to that, which I'd love to think that just teaching critical thinking would really help.
Yeah.
I'm actually not sure it will, and my experience from spending a lot of time communicating complex science to people, and this is quite well backed up by evidence, that just giving people more information or better information, in fact, doesn't really shift the dial on this sort of thing, because a lot of it comes from belief systems and it comes from emotional responses to stressful situations, and just giving people more information sometimes actually makes it worse. So I'd love to think that was the case. I suspect it's probably not.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I have a round of applause for these wonderful panellists? Yeah.